Thank you all for coming out this evening. I know 6 o'clock is an early time to be out for a meeting, but we found that between 6 and 8 gives most people the opportunity to get here. Again, my name is Pat Seppi. I'm with EPA Region 2, and Region 2 encompasses New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. There are 10 total regions at EPA. So the reason we're here tonight is to talk about the Rolling Knolls landfill site. And first, before we get started and take a look at the posters, I'd like to ask my colleagues from EPA to introduce themselves and tell you what their relationship is to the site.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Vaughn. I am a section chief at EPA.
Hello, I'm Betsy Donovan. I'm a project manager for the Rolling Knolls site.
Hello, my name is Juan Fajardo. I'm an attorney at Region 2, and I'm working on the site.
Hi, my name is Supinderjeet Kaur. I'm a remedial project manager at EPA, also working on the site.
And I'm Rachel Griffiths. I'm the geologist on the project with EPA.
Thank you. So this is a little bit different from meetings we usually have at EPA. You're probably used to the more formal public type meetings, but this is kind of an informal pre-meeting leading up to what's called our proposed plan to clean up the site, EPA's preferred remedy to clean up the site. But we wanted to come back out and talk to you because it's been a while since we've been here. So I'm sure that there are new people that haven't been involved in the site before, just as well as people who have been involved for many years. So I think what we'll do, we have like a short presentation. We'll probably do that in about 10 or 15 minutes. So in the meantime, if you'd like to get up and take a look at the posters, you're welcome to do that, and then we can have our presentation. I just want to remind you, please, to sign in if you have it, only because we're trying to generate an email list so that we can reach out to you in the future, with information about the site. Okay, so let's give it about 10 minutes, give people a little more time to get here. And in the meantime, please feel free to walk around and look at the posters. The handout you have is the same as the posters that are here. Thank you. Okay, again, thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate your interest in the site. The reason we're here tonight is to talk about what's coming later this summer. It's called a proposed plan. That will be EPA's preferred remedy to clean up Rolling Knolls. But we wanted to have this meeting tonight because obviously it's been a long time since we've been out here doing outreach. We've realized there's probably new people who have moved to the area within the last 10 years who don't know that much about the site. And of course, there's a group of people who have been very involved in the last 10 years who are concerned and have questions about the cleanup. So what we've done tonight, this is a very informal meeting. It's like a poster session. You've been able to go around and take a look at the posters. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the next steps to get to that formal public meeting sometime this summer, and how we plan on getting there. And then Stephanie will talk a little bit about the history, but the idea is to leave as much time as we can for questions. That's our primary goal here tonight. And please, if you haven't signed in, I would appreciate it if you would do that. We are trying to generate an email list so we can keep more people involved as we move forward. All right, so Stephanie?
Hi again, everyone, and welcome. We're glad you came out on this Monday night to talk with us. As Pat said, there are a number of posters around the room that provide a lot of detail about the site, and we look forward to you looking at them and taking your time to study them. They cover the site history, what EPA has been doing, and what our potential plans are moving forward. But I'll briefly walk you through all of that, and then the entire team will be available to answer any additional questions you have. The Rolling Knolls landfill operated as a municipal landfill from the 1930s to the 1960s. And during this time, the landfill accepted primarily municipal waste from various towns in the region, as well as limited amounts of other waste, including industrial and commercial construction and debris. The landfill officially stopped operations in 1968. It is approximately 200-acre landfill, and a portion of it, roughly 30 acres, is located as part of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and that's why you'll see members from the refuge here. In 1985, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, and EPA began looking at the site to determine if there was any contamination of concern here, and as part of studies going on throughout the country. And in 2003, based on the initial findings, EPA began more formally looking at the site, and we listed it on the national priorities list in 2003. And the national priorities list is also known as the Superfund list, and that's when the site becomes eligible for federal funding and involvement. Since that time, we have been working our way through the Superfund process, and we understand that is a long process that many people find frustrating, but a lot has happened between then and now. The first thing we began working on is the remedial investigation of the site. We then conducted both human health and ecological risk assessments, and we're nearing completion of a feasibility study. And I'll discuss briefly what each of those things are. And this work is being conducted by three responsible parties that are responsible for some of the contamination at the site. These parties include Nokia, Chevron, and Novartis. And they're doing all this work with EPA oversight. EPA reviews all work plans, designs, directly oversees all work being done, but they're funding the work and conducting it and giving us reports for approval, for review and approval. So the first step is the remedial investigation. During what we call the RI, during the investigation, hundreds of samples were collected from soil, from groundwater, from sediment and surface water, and from soil gases that may be entering any buildings. And the results were used to determine two things: the nature of the contamination at the site, what contamination is present basically, and the extent of the contamination. Where is it, and where is it potentially going? We then use that information that was collected specifically at the site to conduct, as I mentioned before, both human health and ecological risk assessments. So as part of the human health risk assessment, we evaluate a site and try to, based on where it is and its usage, what current and potential future receptors or people who may come in contact with the site, who they are, what they might be. So at this site, we looked at trespassers. We looked at people using the site in a recreational capacity. We looked at landscapers. There were landscaping businesses operating on the site. We looked at construction workers, and we looked at potential future residents on the site. And we evaluated what the risk posed to those individuals might be. And the ecological risk assessment focuses on the plants, insects, birds, and other mammals that may come in contact with contamination at the site. So we are concerned with both the human health and the environment. Overall, the primary risks posed by the site are associated with the landfilled portion. So I mentioned it's a 200-acre site. About 170 acres of that have landfilled material on it. There is also, up in the northern portion, there was a shooting range and there's a ball field. We did investigate those areas as well. And about 30 acres of the 170 acres where we have evidence of landfill material is on the Fish and Wildlife property. So what we found was that the primary risks at the site were associated with contamination in the soil in the landfill portion. There is also elevated levels of contamination in the shallow groundwater. However, the shallow groundwater, and that would be part of our cleanup alternatives, but the shallow groundwater, we found that contamination was contained to the site itself, and the deeper groundwater, which might be used as a drinking water source, we did not find evidence of contamination. And in fact, there's a very thick clay layer that separates that shallow groundwater from the deeper aquifer, from the deeper groundwater. But whatever remedy we put in place would include restrictions that would prevent the use of that shallow groundwater until such a time as it were permissible. So that's the remedial investigation and risk assessments. We are currently completing what's called the feasibility study. The feasibility study is where we take all the information we learned previously and we look at ways of addressing the risks posed by the site. Under EPA law, we must first look at no action. What if we just do nothing at the site? So that is included in our alternatives. And then we look at a wide range of alternatives. The feasibility study document is not yet final. So we have a draft written on that poster, and it's not included in your handout, but I've noticed a lot of people are taking pictures, and that is fine. The feasibility study focuses on addressing the risks posed by the site. So we look at various alternatives that address the most contaminated area, either through capping or excavation, and then additional measures at limited portions of the other areas of the site where there might need to be sort of a additional action, other areas of concern. That's the soil portion. For the groundwater, because the levels of contamination at the site in the groundwater are very low and minimally elevated, we think that the soil alternatives would address the contamination in the groundwater, but we are also looking at including some sort of active remedy as necessary, and monitoring of groundwater would occur for as long as needed to assure that the remedy was protective and effective. What is next in the process? As Pat said, at some point this summer, we'll be coming out with what we call a proposed plan. We need to finalize the feasibility study, and just so you know, I didn't say this earlier, but the remedial investigation report and both risk assessments are currently available online at the Rolling Knolls website, which is listed on the handout. So you can look at those if you're interested. And when we finalize the feasibility study, we will also post that online. Shortly after that is finalized, we will come out with what's called a proposed plan. In that, we will lay out in a sort of succinct 10 to 15-page document the history of the site, all the findings, and the alternatives that we're looking at. When we release that proposed plan, it starts a 30-day public comment period, which is a very formal period during which we receive comments from anybody who wants to give us one. In sort of the middle of that public comment period, we will hold a formal public meeting. This is an informal meeting, but during that we'll hold a formal public meeting that's recorded by a stenographer, and it's an opportunity. We'll get up and do a more formal presentation with a PowerPoint and walk you through all this again. Any comments that we receive will be addressed in writing, and we will take them into consideration when we come out with the document at the end of that, which is called the record of decision, and that is where we select the remedy for the site. So people are interested if they actually have a voice in this process, and you do. Part of the reason we're here tonight, prior to release of the proposed plan, is we want to hear from you what your concerns are. We want to share with you, get you reacquainted with the site, but we also want to hear from you and make sure we're not missing something, that we have a good understanding of the community's concerns with the site, and that there might be something we're not aware of. So we welcome any comments you give us tonight, and we will take those into account. And then when we come out with the proposed plan, that will indicate EPA's preferred alternative to address the site. But you will then again have the opportunity to let us know if you have any concerns in a more formal way.
That's fine. That gives everybody a summary. And just as a reminder, Stephanie said on the contact, right at the top is the address for our webpage that has some of those other documents, the remedial investigation, the risk assessments, and once that feasibility study is final, we'll post that on the webpage, and I will send out an email message to everybody who's on the sign-in sheet to let them know, and provide a link to that document, so you'll be able to read it before we have our formal public meeting sometime this summer. Okay, so I think that's pretty much what we have to say. We have, our whole EPA team here ready to answer your questions, so we'd be glad to take any questions right now. Yes, ma'am.
So when you look at the different cleanup options, when it comes to the excavation, that becomes a concern for me when I think about disturbing the soil that's there. We have tons of contaminants there. I was reading about the Superfund site in Edgewater, and they were doing the cleanup there. There was a lot of noxious fumes that were released there, although there's no coal tar at this site. My fear is things that are not healthy becoming airborne in this area that shouldn't be. So I guess my question is, what kind of happened there in Edgewater? How do we avoid something like that happening here? I guess my overall thought would be capping would be the best thing to do in this particular situation. So.
A few things. First, this is a very different site than Quanta. So there are different types of contaminants. There are volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile. So volatile, think nail polish remover. It evaporates very quickly. There's semi-volatile, which will stay in the ground more. And then there are things like metals and PCBs, which really don't tend to become airborne unless they're very, very high concentrations. The primary contaminants that we found at this site, what's driving the risk is PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. So that tends not to be a concern in the air, unless, of course, it's at very high concentrations, and which we don't have here. So there's that. That's one thing to say. Second, whether we excavated or capped, and that's still, we're still evaluating and hearing what folks have to say about that. If we were to excavate some or all of the contaminated area, we would do so in as safe and effective as a way as possible. Our goal is not to make things worse. Our mission is to clean up the environment and to keep the community safe. So if we were to excavate any areas, it would be done, we would have dust control measures. Dust would be the primary concern with the contaminants at this site. We would have air monitoring at the perimeter of where we're actually working and then around the edges of the site to make sure the community is not being exposed. We would have water available to keep the soil wet because wet soil isn't as dusty, things like that. We would load it into trucks that would be covered so that we would prevent any spillage of material on the roads as it were carted away. And whatever alternative we end up selecting, I think the goal would be to minimize the amount of truck traffic in the community because we have been hearing that from everybody, that the site is located at the end of a relatively small residential road. Nobody wants hundreds of trucks going through the community. We are keeping that in mind and evaluating that as part of our considerations. I could share my thoughts on that, but it's not my site, so I feel like
None of us here work on that site, so we don't really have, a lot of information that we would want to share. But I mean, just the fact is, Stephanie mentioned that the contaminants are totally different. You're that naphthalene Creo type smell, that's what's at Quanta. And it's one of those things that there's a high threshold of odor, even though, there might not be any potential health effect. That happens sometimes at sites too. We don't expect anything like that here with the PCBs or the lead or anything like that. If anything were to happen, and again, we wouldn't expect it, there are measures we can also put in control, kind of like, foam to cover over if there's odors or anything like that. But I mean, I know that at Quanta they've tried that too, and that hasn't even worked because of the high levels of the odors. But yeah, here, we've capped many landfills, dug up, excavated lots of landfills, and I'm not aware, of any problems we've ever had with odors.
It's our concern as well, and we would have a very, what's the word I'm looking for, elaborate air monitoring plan to make sure that that's not an issue.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm concerned about the ultimate use of the property once this is all done. And I'm also concerned about the effect on all of the other properties on the periphery.
Sure. As part of the process that I walked through, the remedial investigation and feasibility study process, we did a future use analysis of the site. And based on that and various other factors, including things like you just mentioned, there's no septic in the area, there's limited infrastructure within the landfill itself. We are focusing on a future use that's non-residential, and basically the site would be restored for wildlife conservation, maybe limited recreational use. So the cleanup alternatives assume that the use would be non-residential, and therefore we're not talking about capping the entire area and building homes on it, which would affect the drainage and water flow significantly. What we are focusing on is limited capping or excavation of the most contaminated portion of the site. The exact details of that cap, or any cap that were put in place, would need to be determined during the design, but we are always, EPA is always cognizant during our remedial designs of not affecting the natural hydrology of the area. We don't want to change the groundwater flow, we don't want to change the surface water flow. We want to let nature sort of function as nature is meant to be. So I can say that whatever remedy we put in place should not significantly affect the drainage of the area or the surrounding properties in terms of water, in terms of like increasing flooding, which I think is part of your concern. We went through, I hear what you're saying. We went through our process, we did our risk assessments, and we did come up with unacceptable risks at the site. However, we do not think that excavating all of the landfilled waste, was a municipal landfill. So we are not proposing excavating and carting off 170 acres of municipal waste. Nobody in the community wants that. What we are looking at is capping and or excavating portions of the site. And I can't say there won't be any traffic, any truck traffic. There will need to be some. But we will try to minimize the amount of truck traffic as much as we can. And if that is really the strong preference, which is what I'm hearing from everybody, nobody wants a lot of truck traffic, then we will definitely take that into consideration in our selection of a preferred alternative. There may even be ways of using during the design, this wouldn't be part of the alternative necessarily, but during the design, we may be able to use material that's not impacted by the site within the confines of the 200 acres as capping material to some extent. So we can work to minimize the truck traffic as much as possible. It is our understanding that that's the only viable means of going in and out of the site. During the afternoon session, some folks suggested there might be another way, so if you have any thoughts on that, we'd be happy to hear it. I've heard that idea before. The problem, part of the reason the future use of the site is we don't think is reasonably residential is if you look at this figure over here, you can see it's surrounded by green, which means that's all wetland area. So any roads that would be developed would have to go through a wetland, which is not impossible, but it's difficult. But that's also something that we could determine during design. It wouldn't necessarily affect what alternative we select. So once we select a remedy, I keep saying design, once we select a remedy, we will then conduct what's called a remedial design, which is how we're going to conduct the cleanup. We'll come up with a report, and we can get additional input from the community during that process, and then we will begin implementation of the cleanup. So whether we do excavation or capping, where the capping material comes from is something that we would determine during the design.
Well, what if that has, what if on-site materials were used, if you did the consolidation and encapsulation of the material on the site, I would assume that would be a considerable reduction in costs. And money is one of the driving factors that affects the remedy. So shouldn't that be done at this stage as opposed to the pre-design stage once the remedy is selected?
I'm not sure what impact that would have on cost, actually. So let me walk you through this briefly. So during this feasibility study process, we evaluate a series of alternatives to clean up the site. And we have a very formal process by which we evaluate the alternatives. And there are 9 criteria that we look at. The first 2 criteria we call the threshold criteria. So any alternative we select must be protective of human health and the environment, and it must meet all regulatory standards, all relevant and appropriate guidelines. So once we sort of cut any alternatives that don't meet those 2 threshold criteria, so for example here, we always must look at the no action. The law requires we look at that. In this case, that will not meet the threshold criteria of being protective of human health and the environment, so we can't do nothing. That wouldn't meet our laws. So then there are 5 what we call balancing criteria. So we look at things like short-term effectiveness, what that means is how the remedy can be implemented, what impacts will it have on the community, some of the concerns that are being raised here today. What about dust control? What about safety of the residents? Things like that. Long-term effectiveness. Will whatever we implement be effective in the long term, or are we going to have to be out here for the rest in perpetuity doing work at the site? How much does the remedy reduce the toxicity or mobility of the contamination at the site? So, in this case, capping it in place reduces it less than excavating it. And then we look at cost. It is one of the 5 modifying criteria, but it is only one of the 5, and it's not the driving force by any means. And we also look at implementability, which kind of gets into the truck traffic issue as well. Can we implement the remedy that we're talking about, or is it just something that's impossible to construct? So looking at those first 7 criteria that I just went through, EPA comes up with what we think is the preferred, what we think based on all of the data, all of the science, is the best alternative for the site. But then we come out and we meet with the community, we talk with the state, and the state is our partner in this process. And the last 2 criteria that are formally part of the feasibility process are community and state acceptance. So the community must accept it and the state must accept it. Or I guess I shouldn't say must, but we like to have the community and the state on board. So we weigh all of that and we put all of that into our record of decision. Yes, correct. So we did the risk assessment. We looked at various people who are exposed to the site or potentially exposed. So the risks to the landscapers we actually found were not elevated. The risks associated with the ball field and the shooting range were not elevated, so no work is needed in those areas. The majority of the risks are focused on, if you get a chance after, that a small portion of the landfilled portion of the site. And those risks are primarily associated with elevated concentrations of PCBs. Now, when we went through our risk assessment, a trespasser who might come onto the site about 84 days a year, not about, 84 days a year, we make very conservative assumptions, would have an elevated risk of adverse health effects from coming on the site. And that meets our criteria that we must take in action. Residential exposure would also have very elevated risks, but we're not considering that because we know nobody wants this developed as residential. That's coming through. No, I think it would mainly be limited to no access. My understanding is that the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge does not want to make this part of their refuge. All of our alternatives do include fencing and signage to prevent access to the landfill.
So one of the considerations in the FS and ultimately in the design is going to be the permeability of whatever areas are capped. For the most part, I don't think we're going to need a lot of impermeable caps because that is more intended to cut off any water that's percolating through and impacting groundwater, and we have very limited areas that are doing that. So a few acres possibly. Out of 200.
Groundwater is,
So,
your job is just below.
Right there. You just pointed?
so for the most part, the groundwater flow at the site, this is considered hydraulically up gradient, up here. And the groundwater flows over here and down and over to that side. So for the most part, water is not going up towards Britton Road from the site.
And the capped area.
And I don't know that you can see this gray. This is where this is the majority of where the cap would be. And it's meant to be a soil cap. So it's not going to be totally impermeable.
Can you, with your pointer, can you put where Britton Road is?
Yes, Britton Road is right here. Another part of the cap is going to be grading it. So there are considerations to be able to grade it away from all of that stuff.
To where?
No, so
Down into the Great Swamp.
To Market Road. Anybody from Market
Yeah.
Road? Anybody from Market Road? They're gonna get flooded.
Across the whole site, there's maybe 10 or 15 feet of change in elevation, but that's mostly due to this fire road that was constructed.
when Rachel said she thinks so, based on all of the data we have, it's an informed decision. There are things we can do during the design. As she said, we could grade it so that the water flows this way away. The water naturally flows away from the residential properties, from the center.
And I don't mean to be, excuse me, by any means disrespectful with the
Mhm.
coupling. It's just that when the rains come, there's
No, I understand that, and I've seen it. What I'm saying, though, is from the center of the site, it sort of flows radially. So we can't change the hydrology up here. We can't, it's unfortunate that it floods up here, but what we're going to do here, I should not make anything up here worse. We will take that into consideration, and we could increase the slopes so that water will flow this way even more than it naturally does. These are good things for us to know. We're not trying to minimize it. But it's something that we need to address in the design. Again, our plan is to minimize the truck traffic as much as possible. We don't know yet, but it wouldn't be any larger than the... Oh, no, not a triaxle. No, it never is. It's a dump truck. I mean, they're usually, yeah, single intermodals, yeah, as large as they get, like an intermodal, if you picture, yeah.
I think it's more just the effect that, I mean, obviously, everybody wants everything improved. Of course,
Mhm.
everything wants it to be cleaned up and such, but just seems like we always get the short end of the stick on our street and,
Yeah.
that's what my concern is. It's not even the traffic. That's not as much of an issue as the roads and the water and the stuff that it's going to affect.
Mhm.
Once that's all done and we're still in our.
Right. We're glad to hear all this. We will make sure that we work with you. We could talk with you through the design process and make sure that we don't make anything worse and possibly will improve things. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Well, any of the, whatever you're filling and doing,
Mhm.
affect the natural flow of the water that goes through the swamp now, as it had been, there had been some changes when the whole thing was, years ago, we all started to flood, and now we're not flooding so much anymore in certain times, but you're not gonna be blocking up natural ropes and things that are gonna back it back up
Right.
again.
Our intention is always to keep things as close to how they naturally flow as possible. And so that's why I wasn't saying we would try to improve things, because that's generally not what we try to do. We try to replace what's naturally existing. So if things have improved over the years, maybe we could help continue that improvement. And again, those are things, though, that,
Once it's done, all of a sudden
Yeah.
Our brook is not flowing anymore.
Is there a bond in place to take care of that in the future?
Well, we're not just going to be leaving it out there either. We're going to be monitoring for several years.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
but would it be a bond?
It wouldn't be,
Basis as well.
right. So let me, so yeah, they are good questions. So as I said earlier, we have responsible parties who have conducted the work thus far with EPA oversight. Moving forward, we have every reason to believe those responsible parties and perhaps others will continue to perform the remedial design and remedial action work. We would need to, once we sign the record of decision, we will need to negotiate a new agreement with the PRPs to conduct the design and cleanup. But so they will be there to do the work. And then as part of EPA's process, we will continue to monitor, as Rachel said, and we also have what's called a 5-year review process. So every 5 years, in a very formal way, we come out and we reassess the site. We make sure it's functioning as it should. We make sure the contamination is cleaning up if it takes time, such as with groundwater. We make sure there are no problems. So if there were a drainage problem that we caused, then yes, we would figure out a way of addressing it. That was a long way of saying yes, we would.
But after 5 years?
No. And the 5-year review process goes on until the site is completely cleaned up.
But every 5 years, not continuously, right?
Well, no. So we would, as part of preparing so the 5-year review process is based on data. So we would be collecting data throughout the 5 years. We would be visiting the site on a regular basis. We would be conducting what we call operations and maintenance of the site. So if there are any capped areas, we would be visiting those areas on a regular basis. So we would have an ongoing presence at the site to make sure that there aren't any problems. We would be monitoring the groundwater to make sure that things are improving. So yeah, no, it's not like we are going to cap a little area and then walk away and you'll never see us again. We'll be around for longer than you want us around. Maybe.
What are the present health risks for those who are around the site?
Mm-hmm.
And from the average individual, you talk about an individual trespassing and, if I walk across that site today, what's going to happen to me? Do I have to eat the soil?
Mm-hmm.
What really is the present health effect? And then I'll go back to the original question that was asked, because I think it's a concern to everyone in the area on Britain Road for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Could we potentially be making the situation worse if we did nothing
Mm-hmm.
and just, we don't need ball fields, we don't need public access, we haven't had it for a long time. If we did nothing, would we be better off?
The risks posed by the site, for people living around the site, there would not be any elevated risks. We found no elevated risks with normal usage of the ball fields or the shooting range. If we ignore the potential residential option, the only reasonably anticipated future use that did pose an unacceptable risk would be trespassers coming onto the property. So the exposure would be through ingestion of the soil. So picture teenagers coming onto the property, playing around, getting dirt in their hands, and then you touch your face, you get dirt in your mouth. That's how you ingest the soil. It's not people just picking up soil and eating it. Yeah, no, that's what we call it, ingestion of soil, but just to, it's through contact with the hands. It's actually much lower than what we would typically look at because we thought this site did have a much lower exposure rate than sites typically do. So we tried to be realistic for this. You may all think that that's still too conservative, but that's what the risk assessment was based on. The cancer risks were actually not elevated. The primary risks are associated with non-cancer hazards to your lungs, eyes, liver, things like that. I would have to look it up, and I'm not seeing it right away. So the risks at this site are there. They need to be addressed, but they're by no means, it's by no means the worst Superfund site out there. So we are trying to come up with alternatives that are appropriate for the risks that are present. And whatever alternative we select, our ultimate goal is to make things better, not make things worse. So we will do everything possible to make sure that we are not spreading contamination, that we're not causing a dust problem, that we're not, very simply, that we're not making things worse for the community instead of better.
Stephanie, you mentioned something about like short-term and long-term exposure, because you said something about if you walked across the site once, you know, I mean, there's really no adverse health effect for that. You kind of measure that differently, short-term and long-term?
Correct, yes, yeah. There's no, we might call that acute and chronic risks. There's no, right, walking across the site once or even, you know, we've all been out here many times.
I'm just trying to figure out, if we did nothing, nature ran its course, would we be better off? I'm just, it sounds like we're, I'm just trying to figure out the risks, like, to the neighbors and the community, so great that we have to go in there and disturb everything, or would we just be better to leave it alone?
So a couple things on that. I mean, one of the alternatives we evaluate is just fencing and signage. And that could be protective of human health. The other concern, though, is ecological risk, the risks to the birds and mammals, and those are elevated as well. So in the primary area of concern, we do think some action is needed beyond just the. Sure, yeah, I mean, PCBs, I think I said earlier, they do tend to bind to soil. They stay in soil. They don't like to go into groundwater. So that is why we are seriously looking at just capping in place, because this isn't, we don't think the leaching concern is necessarily significant here. But we would want to then include, or whatever alternative we select, will include groundwater monitoring over the long term to make sure that it doesn't become a problem.
So what are the risks to wildlife? How much has it spread since you began the study now? And what other health risks are there besides to trespassers?
Okay. So I'm not a risk assessor, and we don't have our risk assessors here tonight. So during the formal public meeting, they can talk at length about the risk assessment and the risks. I don't want to say something and then have it be a little not accurate. But I will say this. I mean, there's never consensus in a community. There's never 100% agreement in a community over what an appropriate action might be. I'm hearing that some of you think that perhaps no action other than site controls might be appropriate here. It is an alternative that we did include in the feasibility study. That would, you know, that would not be necessarily protective of the ecological receptors, the robin and the shrew. And I think that other residents might also disagree and want the PCBs and lead are present at significantly elevated concentrations. The area that's impacted is not widespread, but the concentrations are elevated. And, you know, our risk assessment process does support taking an action beyond just site controls.
There are several property owners for the site, and property owners have rights. The remedy that we're likely to select is based on a future use that is not residential. So our remedy is protective if the property is not developed. And we have reason to believe that at least one of the property owners plans to restrict their property's future use. That's a long way of saying that if down the road there is a change and a property owner tries to develop the land, then the remedy might have to change. But that, again, is not something we're expecting. My understanding, and I think I have a good understanding, is that Fish and Wildlife is prohibited from developing their portion of the land.
You're not talking about that.
I am not.
We're not calling it consolidation of the material. However, if you can see on there, there's the dashed area that I was pointing to earlier. That is where the majority of the risks come from. So that's the portion that, let's say, we cap. Let's just for now say it. Then you can see some large black dots on the map, and if you go up later, you can look more closely. Those are other areas where we see elevated risks. So for those areas, we could either excavate them and put them under the cap. We could excavate them and take them off-site, or we could just cap them in place as well as and have multiple caps throughout the site. So if you want to call that consolidation of waste on the site, then that is fine. And some of that waste is on the Fish and Wildlife property, some of it is on the privately owned portion. It's up to 18 feet deep. And there's a surface debris area as well. And all of this would be refined during the design investigation. We actually saw no elevated concentrations of VOCs. There are some... No, I was trying to explain, because someone asked about quanta. And so that's a VOC problem. Here we have some PAHs that are marginally elevated.
What those acronyms mean?
Yeah, sorry. VOCs, again, are volatile organic compounds, so we don't have any of those here. What we have are what are called semi-volatile organic compounds, in particular PAHs, which are polycyclic aromatic compounds. They're found widespread throughout developed areas. The PCBs are found at concentrations as high as, bear with me a second, unless you know offhand, Betsy. I have the numbers here. Or Spender, if you know. No, I was asking the project manager. I have it here. I have it. Yeah. No, it's higher than that. It's in the hundreds. It's above Tosca. I mean, it's elevated. You sound like you know it. Yeah. Okay. Less than 1,000. Here it is. Let me see. Maximum concentration of 126 parts per million. Parts per million. Typical cleanup levels for PCBs are 100. If we put the proposed plan out in the summer, our hope is to have a record of decision signed in 2018, hopefully by the end of the summer. Then we would enter into negotiations with the responsible parties to conduct the design and actual cleanup. That typically takes up to a year. So that would bring us to 2019. Then the design could take 1 to 2 years. This would likely not be a very difficult design. So that would be 2023, we would start the cleanup, 2022, 23. And let me just say that the sites, and I started off with this, we know the process is long and it's frustrating. Sites don't make it onto the Superfund list unless they are particularly complicated and complex. So it does take longer than many of the state sites, but there's reason.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.